Happy Sunday, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Britte Sloothaak, and I currently hold the position of Curator of Contemporary Art and Public Programs at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, and it's my honor to introduce the Visiting Fellow for Modern and Contemporary Art today, a program made possible to the joint efforts between the Stedelijk Museum, the UvA University of Amsterdam, OSK, which is the Research School Art History, and the RKD, the Netherlands Institute for Art History. Our speaker today is Mignon Nixon, and she's the 6th visiting fellow since this position was established in 2015. And she has been invited to a program due to her absolute appreciation of her renowned research on the topics of interactions on art with feminism, gender, and on questions of sexuality, peace, and war. She is professor of modern and contemporary art history at the University College London, and her publications include Fantastic Reality, Louise Bourgeois, and October Files on Eva Hesse. And her research has been, through the years, supported by many institutions, among which the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. And for her lecture, we invited Professor Nixon to contextualize the key notions of her research on artists' response on continual war in relation to gender, politics, feminism, and toxic masculinity. And for the upcoming 45 minutes, Professor Nixon will elaborate on 2 performative events in conjunction with these topics. One by artist and musician couple Yoko Ono and John Lennon in Amsterdam, and one by Yayoi Kusama in New York City. And she will zoom in on the expressive and activist potential of the body and the artist's use of the media to advocate peace in times of war. Now, later today, this Sunday, starting at 4 p.m., Professor Nixon will engage in a live Zoom conversation between her, Sophie Berby from the University of Amsterdam, and Emma Haraji Herman from the Stedelijk Museum to dive deeper in the notions raised today, while touching upon other artists' works of the 60s and 70s, including works by Martha Rosler and Nancy Spiro. Now, so it is still possible to register for this live Zoom conversation via events@rkd.nl. So please RSVP via this email address, and Luz Barnard from the RKD will make sure that your question reaches our speakers today. Now, then, without no further ado, I want to give the floor or the screen, as we are mostly used today, to Professor Mignon Nixon. A personal thank you for carving out the time in your calendar to elaborate on your research that has been inspiration for many of us in the field. And to our audience, thank you for joining, and we hope to see you at our live Zoom session at 4 p.m. this afternoon. You can RSVP and send in your questions via events@rkd.nl.
I'd like to start by expressing my thanks to the Stedelijk Museum for inviting me to speak with you all, and for taking so much trouble to enable me to participate in this way. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's listening for taking the time out of your day to join me. I'd hoped, of course, to be able to be in Amsterdam for this occasion. But since it's not possible to do that, I still want to begin there, not in the Amsterdam of today, but in that of another moment, the late 1960s. So, in March of 1969, at the height of the American war in Vietnam, the avant-garde artist, filmmaker, and composer Yoko Ono and the musician John Lennon announced that they would marry in Gibraltar and then celebrate their honeymoon in Amsterdam. They invited the press to join them. The wedding would be private, but the honeymoon would be public. They have invited friends and interested parties to witness their love on their honeymoon, London's Daily Mirror newspaper exclaimed under the headline, "A love-in for Lennon and Yoko." As Lennon recalled, the press was sweating to get in first because they thought we were going to be making love in bed, you see. Make love, not war was the slogan of the anti-war movement of the time, and Ono and Lennon were committed peace activists. but the scene that greeted the press on arrival at the Amsterdam Hilton Hotel on the 24th of March, 1969, defied media expectation. Reporters and photographers arrived to find the couple sitting up in bed, side by side, propped against snowy pillows and dressed in vintage night clothes. Asked to explain their intentions, Lennon replied, "We intend to stay for 7 days and then leave." Getting married, as performed by Ono and Lennon, was a political act. "We worked for 3 months thinking out the most functional approach to boosting peace before we got married," Ono later recalled. "We decided that if we were going to do anything like get married," Lennon elaborated, "we would dedicate it to peace." Ono and Lennon put their bodies on the line in a new way, expressing solidarity with nonviolent protest, conscientious objection, draft resistance, sit-ins, teach-ins, and other tactics used in opposition to the escalating US involvement in Vietnam. Inviting the world at large to their honeymoon, Ono and Lennon made this private ritual the occasion for public reflection on the warlike tendencies of everyday life, including the institutions of marriage and the family. Transforming intimate relationships, they suggested, is part of the work of making peace, part of what needs to be done in bed to prevent war. The couple's companionable ease with each other also hinted that the bed can be a refuge from sexual posturing, a place to get some peace, including sexual peace. Adopting an earnest and affectionate tone and dressing and styling themselves similarly, the couple played up their commonalities, revealing the egalitarian balance and reciprocity of their relationship, which they actively performed for the cameras, addressing their world audience together. In a stream of interviews, appearing side by side, physically supporting each other, and taking it in turns to respond to questions from the press, they demonstrated that theirs was a relationship in which intimacy and equality, the personal and the political, were intrinsically connected. By enacting a public ritual of peace in the celebration of a marriage between citizens of former enemies, one that crossed barriers of culture, class, and race, they offered their union as a symbol of hope. Their marriage of equals, put on display at the height of a war stoked by racialized hatred against an Asian people, was a provocation to reflect on our cultural norms of marriage and war. Bed peace, the sign positioned over Ono's side of the bed, took on the significance of woman's equality with her male partner and a feeling at home in a shared bed as an integral dimension of peace. As the art historian Christine Stiles has remarked, Lennon and Ono returned politics to the bedroom, site of private neuroses, battleground of the sexes, and territory of their possible recovery, close quote. Conspicuously absent is the hyperbolic masculinity of the pop icon. Hairpiece, the placard hanging over Lennon's side of the bed, where he lay twinned with Ono, alluded to gender stereotype as a factor in militarism and war. Stretched out beside Ono, Lennon aligned himself with his partner, a Japanese avant-garde artist, war survivor, pacifist, and feminist. Lennon's long hair and passive posture, gently parodying contemporary gender anxieties about boys who look like girls, distanced him from the machismo of war. Defining his political role in alliance with a co-equal woman, Lennon adopted a posture that was rare even in the anti-war movement, which was still dominated by the same masculine privilege that prevailed in the culture at large. At the time of the bed-in for peace, the anti-war movement was in crisis. In November of 1968, Richard Nixon had been elected to the presidency following a bitter election campaign. Nixon was a hardline critic of the anti-war movement and a staunch supporter of violent police action against anti-war protesters. Coining the term silent majority to appeal to pro-war voters, he called for law and order as a response to nonviolent protest, launching vociferous attacks on the anti-war movement. Elected on a so-called secret plan for peace, which he never revealed or certainly implemented, Nixon triumphed by attacking young people who put their bodies on the line against the war. One effect of Nixon's rise to power was a resurgence of masculine supremacy in the anti-war movement. In one notorious incident at the counter-inaugural protest staged by the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam in 1969, so this is months before the bed-in, men in the audience heckled two feminist speakers, Marilyn Webb and Shulamit Firestone. Jeering at Webb to take it off, the hecklers demanded that she be removed from the stage and even threatened to rape her. War as a culture of sexualized violence had come to the anti-war movement in dramatic fashion. Meanwhile, Ono and Lennon were quietly preparing their bed-in. Counteracting the attempts by some men in the anti-war movement to intimidate their female peers with threats, or by attempting to force them even bodily off the public stage, Lennon and Ono shared a bed, a world stage, a feminist politics, and a peace message. Both actively embraced feminism. The bed-in for peace was a feminist intervention in the gender politics of war, militarism, and the anti-war movement. As long as war and gender norms align, they suggested, we struggle to conceive of peace. Returning to the bed-in for peace now in our own time of hyperbolic, toxic masculinity and resurgent militarism reveals why gender continues to matter in resistance to war. When Ono and Lennon performed the bed-in for peace, Richard Nixon was enjoying what is called in American politics the honeymoon period after the inauguration, when press coverage tends to be favorable toward the incoming administration and public support for the new president is typically high. Broadcast to a world audience from outside the United States, the bed-in for peace, a honeymoon that coincided with Nixon's own, instead harnessed the international mass media. Taking to the airwaves rather than the streets, the bed-in occupied a space where peaceful protest could be performed while circumventing the authorities, while at the same time attracting the attention of a world audience. In this way, the event exploited the global reach of mass media communications and mass culture to extend the peace movement beyond the effective control of a national government. Guile, they showed, could overcome press manipulation and de facto censorship to render television and radio spaces of political debate. I like to fight the establishment by using methods that are so far removed from establishment-type thinking that the establishment doesn't know how to fight back, Ono explained. As Lennon pointed out, the establishment knows how to play the game violence, and it's easier for them if they can recognize you and shoot you. At this time, in the aftermath of Nixon's election to the presidency, the anti-war movement was riven by internal divides. In March of 1969, the year of the bed-in, the New York Times reported that the movement was in such disarray that public pressure over the war has almost disappeared. With this in mind, Ono and Lennon took to the airwaves to embody highly visible modes of resistance that evaded the violence of the state. Staging the Bed-In for Peace as a media event, the couple pitched their peace campaign in the discursive space of the media image, where war is also waged. The war in Vietnam was famously a television war, an image war. Here, Ono and Lennon found their opening. Publicity is our game, Lennon explained. The Beatles thing was that, and that was the trade I've learned. In this way, the Bed-In exposed a gap in the violent suppression of dissent, reinforcing the couple's message that protests by peaceful means could still reverberate in a political situation increasingly seized by violence. Asked by a reporter in Amsterdam if they felt they were being hounded by the press, the couple replied with their typical habit of completing one another's sentences, "The amount of hounding we get, we're going to turn it into something good." Ono and Lennon did do something good. They were able to outwit the exercise of state violence and censorship against dissent, and, at least for a week, to change the topic of conversation from war to peace. Much of the press dismissed the Bed-In as a stunt and reported it as a celebrity lark rather than a serious news story. Yet, by virtue of its perceived triviality and naivety, the Bed-In seemed to merit special attention from the press, garnering front-page headlines in every major European and North American newspaper. Vilified for mesmerizing Lennon and accused of breaking up the Beatles, Ono, avant-garde Japanese conceptual pacifist artist, was multiply other. The couple's response to the climate of hysteria that surrounded their partnership was to use the fascination and hostility it aroused to provoke thinking about feminism, racism, and war. The war in Vietnam, but also the war at home, in America and everywhere. Inviting the world at large to their honeymoon, the couple made this conventionally private celebration the occasion for public reflection on war, but also on warring in everyday life, on the social rituals and structures that sustain war and inhibit peace. If anyone thinks our campaign is naive, Lennon countered the charge. Let them do something else. And if we like their ideas, we'll join in with them. But until then, we'll do it the way we are. At the level of its media strategy, the Bed-In seems anything but naive. As the media historian Daniel Hallen has observed, peaceful protest is typically reported when violence breaks out. Further, Hallen remarked, most film reports on the anti-war movement contained no substantial discussion of the war. However naive it may have appeared at the time, the Bed-In for Peace nimbly avoided these pitfalls. Aware that peaceful protest without the threat of violence does not make for sexy television news, Ono and Lennon hyped the event with hints of sex, but also cannily anticipated television's reluctance to broadcast substantial discussion of the war. They held an unscripted running press conference with a constant stream of guests, a reality peace TV show in effect. And every day they pored over the coverage, scouring the papers in bed, reinforcing the impression that the Bed-In was news. After the success of the Amsterdam Bed-In, Ono and Lennon planned to reprise the event in the United States. We tried to do it in New York, Lennon later explained, but the American government wouldn't let us in. They knew we'd done it in Amsterdam. They didn't want any peaceniks here, which is what we heard the department of whoever controls that said. Declared persona non grata by United States immigration authorities at the excuse of a trumped-up marijuana possession charge in Britain, Lennon sought permission to visit Canada. Right next door to the other place, as he put it, Canada was close enough that interviews and news coverage could be transmitted across the border. If we said anything in Canada, Ono observed, we knew it would get to the US. By holding the second bed-in across the border, the couple drew attention to the US government's suppression of their anti-war message. But they also highlighted the exiling of internal dissent by which American draft resistors and deserters were driven out of the country to escape the reach of the authorities. At the same time, by contriving an event with wide mass cultural appeal, they smuggled their peace message past the filters of the American mainstream media that prevented international opposition to the war from being widely reported, and so demonstrated the government's vulnerability to protest over the airwaves, as they had in Amsterdam. The second bed-in, staged from May 26 to June 2nd, began at Toronto's King Edward Sheraton and moved from there to Montreal's Queen Elizabeth Hotel. A local disc jockey broadcast his radio show from the bedside of John and Yoko. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation installed a television crew to record the event for a program to be aired on a weekly current affairs show. The idea for the program, one producer recalled, was inspired by the US government's refusal to allow the couple to visit. Some of the younger producers on the program, the producer noted, hit upon the idea of bringing the country to them instead. In an echo of the television news formula pioneered in Vietnam that sends embedded journalists into the war zone with the troops to chase combat footage, bed-in journalists found themselves covering a live peace story. Visitors included Tom Struthers, see him on the left there, whose popular Struthers Brothers television show had recently been canceled by US network CBS for its anti-war satire. The activist and comedian Dick Gregory, you'll see him in a moment, the Village Voice's jazz critic Nat Hentoff, and Timothy Leary, here on the right, the maverick California gubernatorial candidate and guru of the counterculture. There's Gregory interviewing the couple. And then there was the right-wing cartoonist Al Capp. Introducing himself to Ono and Lennon and their assembled visitors as, quote, that dreadful Neanderthal fascist, Capp, sporting a crisp blazer and silk handkerchief, turned up at the bed-in at the invitation of the CBC and promptly cast himself as the proverbial stiff in the room. A popular syndicated newspaper cartoonist and familiar figure on late-night television, Capp was a cultural holdover from the 1950s, attempting to keep alive a media career as cultural mores rapidly shifted. He saw all hippies and layabouts and slobs, one critic summarized. He hated their hairiness. By 1969, his vitriolic attacks on the counterculture, the anti-war movement, and students had begun to wear thin, and he was being eased off high-profile shows. The CBC brought him in to represent the hawk's eye view of the war, and he jumped at the chance. To Lennon's invitation to sit on the edge of the bed here, Mr. Capp, he demurred. I'd like to sit on something hard, he declared. A folding metal chair was produced. Settled onto this secure perch, from which he could look down on the couple from behind his thick spectacles, Capp launched into his prepared questions. What about during World War II, he began, as if to embark on a common line of interrogation about appeasement and the moral stakes of adhering to a pacifist stance. But then Capp abruptly veered in another direction. What, he wondered aloud, if Hitler and Churchill had gotten into bed, which Hitler would have clearly enjoyed? Capp's primary association to a bed-in was sleeping with the enemy. Erupting when Ono interrupted his mano a mano with Lennon, Cap dismissed her. Good God, you've got to live with that? I can see why you want peace. Nice guy, Lennon acidly remarked. For Cap, who at another point in the interview insistently described himself as just normal, to be confronted with a woman and man lying in bed talking of peace gives rise to homoerotic fantasies about dominant men. In effect, Cap suggests it's easier for him, being just normal, to imagine Churchill in bed with Hitler than to accept that Lenin enjoys his co-equal relationship with Ono. As the couple settles back for some pillow talk about Cap, the bed-in's theatrical canniness in setting peace on a different plane from that of war clarifies. By lowering themselves onto the bed, Ono and Lennon draw camera angles downward, concentrating attention on the plane where the body's vulnerability is most fully exposed, in sleep, in sex, in death. All day, for 7 straight days, Ono and Lennon allowed cameras to film them and microphones to record them. They offered to answer any question. They spoke as a political couple, helping to rectify by example the gender divisions and sexism of the dominant culture, but also of the anti-war movement, in which women and men played separate and unequal roles. In their many joint interviews, they patiently articulated the aims of the protest, using the pronoun we to underscore their commitment to each other, but also the continuity between themselves and the audience. We are all in this, you see, Ono explained. As counter-programming to television's daily diet of war and news broadcasts with their tight formats and reliance on official accounts of the war, the bed-in was an unscripted event in which visitors were invited to ask anything, which Al Cap certainly did. No secrets, no time limit. Come in as long as you like. You've got everything you need to know about John and Yoko, or what we stand for, or what we are, Lennon encouraged. They sang, talked, pleaded, bantered, larked, and told jokes to keep the camera rolling. Effectively immobilized themselves, the couple mirrored the television audience, people lying in bed, wishing for peace, trying to imagine what to do about it. Surrogates for the audience in the form of friends, journalists, and fans drop in to talk, milling around and arranging themselves on the floor and the bed, broadcasting from bedroom to bedroom, turning the bedroom itself into a television and recording studio. The bed-in inverts the passive activity of watching war on television into the political act of making broadcasts about peace. Alert to television's reluctance to broadcast substantial discussion of the war, as media historian Daniel Hallen later corroborated, they held an unscripted running press conference. They wrote and recorded a single, Give Peace a Chance. And they filmed the entire episode themselves, producing their own version of events. A bed, a film, Bed Peace. And this is just the title page of that film, which you could watch. By staying in bed and proposing that people grow your hair until there's peace, they also expressed solidarity with those whose refusal to go to war or to serve out their tours had driven them underground or across the border to Canada. They welcomed an American Army deserter to their bedside, introducing him as a 22-year-old from Boston and the Fort Dix stockade. By 1969, civil disobedience on the part of those expected to wage the war, troops in the war zone, threatened to cripple it. In 1967, veterans of conscience founded Vietnam Veterans Against the War and began lobbying Congress to end the war, bearing witness to its uncommon brutality, its pattern of atrocity, and its unstated policy of genocide. Even soldiers in the ranks joined the anti-war movement, publishing underground newspapers, defying dress codes by growing their hair long and drawing peace signs on their helmets, and sometimes refusing to fight. What would you do in case of a war? One questioner demanded of Lenin, as if there were no war, as if he were not doing anything. I'd die of fright, he shot back, maintaining his stance alongside Ono. He refused the provocation to man up and shunned the possessive attitude to war often displayed by anti-war activists. Relinquishing the myth of heroic masculinity, he implied, was a path to psychic relief, a refusal with the potential to expand political and social consciousness. Walking through Times Square in the snow in December of 1969, Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe happened upon a billboard declaring, "War is over if you want it." Smith liked the message. Mapplethorpe was impressed that it was in Times Square. "You won't get it unless you want it," Lennon warns in Give Peace a Chance. "If you want it now, say it now." 6 months after recording Give Peace a Chance with a bedroom full of visitors, the couple kicked off an international publicity campaign for peace, timed for the Christmas season. Opening simultaneously in 12 cities around the world, and launched with a peace concert at the Lyceum Theatre in London, the commercial-scale campaign featured billboards in landmark locations prized by advertisers promoting the next big thing. War is over. The black and white signs proclaimed in giant type over a caveat, "If you want it," printed in much smaller letters. "Happy Christmas from John and Yoko" ran along the bottom edge of the signs. Posters, handbills, and postcards also circulated around the world, supplemented by full-page advertisements in major newspapers. "Many other people who are rich," Ono explained, "are using their money for something they want. We intend to do the same." Imagine the Lennon song that would become an anthem of the international peace movement until the present day, borrows directly from Ono's avant-garde practice, as Lennon belatedly acknowledged. "The lyric and the concept," he explained, "came from Yoko." The couple famously met at an exhibition of her work at the Indica Gallery in London. Asked how their peace campaign began, Lennon observed that the two were in different bags. Adapting Ono's instruction pieces and her scores, in particular those she described as events, to their double act, the couple coined the term bagism as the official name of their pacifist politics. Event, Ono explained, is not a get-togetherness, but a dealing with oneself. It has no script, as happenings do, though it has something that starts it moving. The closest word for it may be wish or hope. War is over. The bed-in affirms desire, wishing, and hoping as part of politics. To imagine bringing peace into existence in the present, the couple suggested, is the psychic breakthrough that is needed to stop this war now as a first step toward creating peace. Throughout 1969 and 1970, Ono and Lennon continued their public campaign, enunciating a present tense for peace. They designated 1970 year one of the new era of peace. "Being who we were," Lennon later ruefully remarked, "people expected us to produce peace." But the peace campaign achieved some important things. It intervened in a divisive and bitter politics by ministering to desire and hope, to the idealism of youth that war also courts, eliciting desire, welcoming it, sharing it with humor, tenderness, and pleasure. Ono and Lennon embodied a sensual continuity between intimate relationship and the ideal of social transformation. Politics, the political theorist Chantal Mouffe maintains, quote, needs to have a real purchase on people's desires and fantasies to move us, close quote. For the psychoanalyst Juliet Mitchell, quote, peace has to be something we work for against our norms, close quote. With Mouffe and Mitchell, Ono and Lennon suggest that by working against our norms, we might begin to engender a politics of equality, restrain our violence, and feel moved to give peace a chance. Working for peace, they suggested, might entail reinventing our everyday gender roles. The bed-in for peace has mostly been remembered as a quixotic gesture with scant political import. This dismissive reception of the event and its provocation to think about the place of everyday gender roles in peace politics is in itself a gendered response, disavowing questions of gender and subjectivity that are fundamental to the problem of war. Writing in the late 1980s, in the aftermath of the American war in Vietnam, the cultural historian Susan Jeffords underscored the regressive force of what she called remasculinization. In this drive to restore male privilege, energized by hostility towards feminism and more generally towards women, Jeffords identified what she called a pervasive masculinism. This resonates again powerfully today. Returning to the bed-in for peace reveals why gender continues to be important in working for peace against our norms. Ono and Lennon were hardly alone in considering what performative artistic techniques might offer to working for peace against our norms, or in bringing avant-garde cultures into synergy with the mass media. Before the bed-in for peace and war is over if you want it, there was another worldwide publicity campaign for peace launched in New York by Yayoi Kusama in the summer of 1968. It began with Anatomic Explosion on Wall Street. On a quiet Sunday morning, July 14, 1968, 4 professional dancers, 2 women and 2 men, accompanied by a conga drummer under the direction of Kusama, appeared on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, stripped and danced, first in front of the Stock Exchange and then on the plinth of the George Washington statue opposite. The artist, clothed in a flowing frock and discreetly accompanied by her lawyer, spray-painted polka dots on their bodies. Cameras clicked away for several minutes until a lookout announced the imminent arrival of the police. In the press release for her Anatomic Explosion on Wall Street, headlined "Naked Event Outside the Stock Exchange at 11 a.m. on Sunday, July 14, 1968, she set out her brief, quote, "Kusama invites you to this anti-war event to save our young men for love and peace. Let's let the lost generation generate." Witnessed only by a few reporters and photographers, a clutch of tourists, and parishioners of the nearby Trinity Church, the performance was front-page news the next day. A UPI story, "All's quiet on stock market, but Wall Street bears busy," appeared in papers across the country, running opposite the Associated Press account of the new US Defense Secretary Clark Clifford's first visit to Vietnam in many editions. "Clifford gets briefings during visit" was the main story of the day, reflecting the confused state of the war in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's departure, and Lyndon Johnson, Nixon's predecessor's dramatic announcement that he would not seek re-election to the presidency. As usual, the above-the-fold photograph in most papers showed US forces bogged down in a war that was now finally exposed as hot. At a time when the American public was absorbing the revelation that US forces were bogged down in Vietnam and that the political and military establishment had manipulated the press by presenting a false narrative of the war, Kusama's protests bloomed on the front pages of major newspapers, shadowing the war news. Anatomic Explosion on Wall Street was one of many political protests Kusama conducted around New York with a changing cast of accomplices during the 1968 presidential campaign. In the last few months, anatomic explosions have been taking place on the sidewalks of New York, reported Vogue magazine. Following an exact pattern Vogue revealed, they happen quickly, unexpectedly, and invariably in front of famous public buildings and monuments. My end is to end war, Kusama explained to the Associated Press. My name was in the tabloids day after day, she later recalled, adding, this said a lot about where people's real interests lay and proved how starved they were for love and peace. Until relatively recently, Kusama's anatomic explosions were largely dismissed in art historical accounts of the period, if they were mentioned at all, a continuation of the derisive reception they received from the art press at the time. In contrast to the news media, which reported Kusama's interventions widely, the art press ridiculed them, decrying, in the case of the Village Voice, Kusama's gross lust for publicity. The artist was undeterred. Publicity is critical to my work, she explained, because it offers the best way of communicating with large numbers of people. Avant-garde artists, she argued, should use mass communication as traditional painters use paint and brushes. Calling her protests press happenings, she claimed to stage them exclusively for the benefit of the press, with the express aim of having them reported by the newspapers as a kind of repeated interruption to the war news. The New York Times, at least, seemed to credit that Kusama's protests were the genuine article. Bare facts presented in a political protest, one Times headline announced in November 1968. On the eve of voting in the presidential election, the paper reported, a group directed by Kusama appeared at the New York City Board of Elections on Varick Street, wearing only oversized cutout masks of the candidates, Republican Richard Nixon, so he's the one on the right, Democrat Hubert Humphrey, so he's the one closest to Kusama, and third-party white supremacist George Wallace on the left. Kusama, directing the event, distributed a press release urging the candidates to, quote, reveal the bare facts about themselves. On another chilly day, a week later, following the election of Nixon, Kusama and her entourage distributed copies of an open letter to the president-elect. This demonstration, protest, event took place on Reed Street and Lower Broadway as part of a post-election Kusama intervention. Let's forget ourselves, dearest Richard, and become one with the absolute, altogether in the altogether, the letter implored. On this occasion, the New York Times story was longer. 4 persons stripped off their clothes on Reed Street near Lower Broadway yesterday and handed out copies of an open letter to President-elect Richard M. Nixon that said that anatomic explosions are better than atomic explosions, the article related. The naked protesters, 3 men and a woman, stood on the sidewalk for 15 minutes and were daubed with body paints while a crowd of 150 people watched as Miss Kusama urged peace in Vietnam. By the following day, that story had been picked up by dozens of newspapers across the United States. Kusama's open letter, perhaps the most improbable of all appeals for peace in the era, read as, follows. An open letter to my hero, Richard M. Nixon. Our Earth is like one little polka dot among millions of other celestial bodies, one orb full of hatred and strife amid the peaceful silent spheres. Let's you and I change all that and make this world a Garden of Eden. Let's forget ourselves, dearest Richard, and become one with the Absolute, all together in the altogether. As we soar through the heavens, we'll paint each other with polka dots, lose our egos in timeless eternity, and finally discover the naked truth. You can't eradicate violence by using more violence. This truth is written in the spheres with which I will lovingly, soothingly adorn your hard masculine body. Gently, gently, dear Richard, calm your manly fighting spirit. Yayoi Kusama. Mingling the contemporary patois of cosmic love with the doomsday psychic scenario of atomic annihilation, she cajoled the figure of Nixon with the fantasy of self-obliteration in which we forget ourselves in love rather than destroy ourselves in war. Here, the biographical facts must come into play. Born in 1929, Kusama was 16 when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. In 1968, she found herself in New York, protesting the escalating US bombing of Vietnam, an aerial war that relied for its lethal efficiency on American naval bases in Japan. Her spirited protests shunned the role of war victim. Few even seemed to notice that her reference to anatomic explosions might have anything to do with the atomic bombing of Japan. By protesting the war in Vietnam as a youthful denizen of New York's Bohemia, she adopted a position inside, not outside, the culture responsible for the war. Disarmingly playful, Kusama's pseudo-political happenings, as one newspaper described them, use ludic tactics to dramatize the absurdity of war and the ridiculous lengths to which war protest must go to attract the attention of the papers. Crashing the papers day after day, Kusama made a virtue of scorn. She proposed a more speculative mode of resistance to war than that of anti-war militancy, one that asked, in effect, what makes us lovers of war? And that's the question on which I'd like to end. And thank you so much for your attention, for being with me. I really look forward to talking with you when we have that opportunity shortly. Thanks a lot.